So it looks like we are live. Cool. Looks like we have some attendees joining. Welcome, welcome. And feel free to put in the chat what your #1 fundraising challenge at year end is. We'd love to get a little context before we jump into this presentation.
Yeah, for sure. So grateful that so many people have joined us. It's such a busy time of the year, like for year end. And so we're excited to be able to share some best practices and tips. But yeah, what are some of the challenges you faced? I remember when I was doing growth and fundraising for a nonprofit, like September always felt really busy. And then you get to October and it'd be like, oh gosh, now we have to really step up our game. It was kind of like a sprint for 75 days, or that's what it felt like. And so I'm sure many of you are handling and dealing with that right now as well. So love to hear more about that.
Cool. Tori said, how can we express urgency without annoying our constituents with too many emails? And then Camille said, I feel like there's donor burnout or giving is really slowed. Yeah, both really good points. Definitely second one resonates with donor burnout and combating fundraising fatigue. I think that's something we're going to hit on. And then expressing urgency without being annoying, I think also ties into this personalization piece. But
yeah, for sure. It's really tough. I think everyone's just burnout in general. It's not even just donors. I know before everyone jumped on, Eric and I were talking about people being zoomed out. I feel like this is like a new thing. It'd be a great Halloween costume. Like, what does zoomed out look like as a Halloween costume? But yeah, it's really tough. And I think we all are dealing with different challenges, but there's still interesting ways to navigate that. So hopefully some of the things we'll share later will be helpful for you, Camille. That's an interesting challenge, Stephanie. So you said you're brand new and you're identifying specifically what we do for our donors. Could you expand on that? I want to hear a little bit more. That seems like there's some more to unpack there. What cause area are you working on? What caused you to start this new adventure? I'd love to hear a little bit more so we could provide more context. That would be valuable to you.
cool. As Stephanie is typing, I think we'll give it about one more minute, and then we'll be ready to get into the presentation. And again, if you guys have any questions throughout, feel free to put them in the Q&A window or the chat, and we'll leave time at the end to get to those. And yes, Tori, we are all the attendees are muted.
I was going to say, I feel like we need some music to kickstart this webinar.
Yeah,
I feel like we need to
music.
spice it up a little bit. Let's see what we can do.
Camille just said, I heard one marketing pros say that the 2 weeks on either side of the election are dead. Do you think that's true?
Oof.
That is a very interesting point and really timely as well. Facebook just released that, I can't remember the specific date, but they're going to be disallowing all ads after November 4th for an undisclosed amount of time that relate to social issues or politics. So obviously that applies to a lot of our partners. And we are working to find ways around that. I think oftentimes when we have ads set live already, we can keep them live. We just change the creative, but you can change like bidding and targeting strategies. So one option is set all of your ads that you think you're going to need live now and have them in the future. But yeah, it's definitely going to be a crazy time. Facebook won't be allowed, so CPMs might decrease, but at the same time, people's feeds will be clogged and they'll be thinking about other things. So I think it just comes down to context. But I'm sure Noah is as well, but Communities is always happy to talk through any specific issues you have if you just want to schedule time with us, and we can see how we can work out like specific solutions there. But that's a really good point.
Yeah, I also think just to we can talk a little bit more on this throughout the presentation today, but I do think we need to define what like dead means. Like that's a pretty dramatic statement. What we know isn't true is generosity is not going to die, because it never has, and it's always resilient. But it might be that it's really difficult to communicate with your donors during those time periods. So I think it's just making sure we frame, quote unquote dead a little bit better there, because at the end of the day, like you can still connect with your donors. That's not going to stop. And I don't think we should let any situation prevent us from being able to do that. We just have to be conscious of the context that we're communicating in. So we can get a little bit more into that as well. We might just be better off, Eric, just doing live Q&A for an hour. It seems like people have lots of questions. Yeah, absolutely. Getting attention from donors is going to be quite tough, Elizabeth. Great point. One thing that we've seen here at Virtuous is attention is actually the most valuable currency right now. And as you define your fundraising programs, you have to kind of keep that in mind, because I think it's really important. It's not even what you're asking them to give, it's about giving them their attention, and being a good steward of attention once you have it is crucial. So it does look like we lost Eric, but we're just going to press on. And so thanks everyone again for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's presentation. And then hopefully Eric will be able to again. Oh, there he is. Hey, Eric, welcome back. We were just about to get started, so I'll let you take it over from here.
Awesome. I think my Wi-Fi must have just cut out because I think I just got booted from the meeting. But yeah, so good to, I'm excited to get into this. My name's Eric. I'm a digital marketing specialist here at Community Boost. And Noah, if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, for sure. So, hey, everyone, I'm Noah Barnett. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Virtuous, the responsive fundraising platform. And I'll be sharing a little bit more about that later on. So no need to chat about that now.
Cool. Go to the next slide. Yeah, so welcome. This is a presentation prepared by Virtuous about how to raise responses this year end and beyond. I know Noah put a lot of work into this presentation, and it's really packed a lot of valuable insights that are going to be super impactful for any nonprofit that's trying to really take their fundraising to the next level. And a lot of it comes with personalization, but he's going to get a lot more into it. then I'll be able to. So let's kick it off. A little bit about us. We're a community boost. We're a nonprofit marketing agency. We started as a small team just building websites for nonprofits and have worked our way up to working with 400 plus nonprofits. We focus on a lot of the top of funnel actions. So like donor acquisition, which is like Google ad grants, Facebook ads. We also do website conversion design, email marketing. But working, 200 plus nonprofits and being really intimately entwined in their fundraising systems. Something that we often notice is that a lot of nonprofits are like handcuffed to tech stacks that don't empower them to get the best results that they can. And a lot of that comes from not being able to personalize the way they interact with different donors. And so we started this partnership with Virtuous, and they're really leaders in the space when it comes to making tech that really helps nonprofits be able to truly personalize our outreach. And then he's going to share the results that you see from that, which is just donors that are more valuable to your organization. But for that, I'll hand it off to Noah, and I'm excited for this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. And really thankful for the Community Boost team and the community of nonprofit marketers and fundraisers and really just leaders on so many important causes. And thank you to everyone who's attending this session. We're really grateful that you're here. We know attention is the most valuable currency right now. We were already chatting about that before the webinar with some of the attendees. And I don't take that lightly. So hopefully we'll steward your attention today in the best way possible and really give you some practical tips on how you can really increase the responses of your year-end fundraising campaigns in an environment that feels relatively noisy. And so some of the research that I wanted to share first is going to help set up the foundation for the 6 tips or best practices that we're going to share in the latter half of the webinar today. And so we really need to lay the groundwork, because before we can understand how we raise retention rates, it's not just, or raise response rates, it's not just the best practices that are going to get you there, but it's an understanding of what's different, what's changed. And that requires us to start with the core foundations of fundraising before we dig into the best practices and tips. And so I want to start here and actually tell you a quick story. So this little boy's name is Francis. Francis lives in a slum in the right outside of the Uganda, in Kampala, Uganda. And I had the privilege to actually spend time with Francis in his community. I actually got to spend time with his family. And one thing I realized is that when we visited him, his mother actually greeted us and asked us to come in and welcomed us in and had a hospitality like I would hope that I would be able to provide people that visited my home. Now, given this room was just a one-room house where they all lived in the middle of a slum, but the thing is that it reminded me and put an imprint on me that we're not that different. Like, regardless of our circumstances and where we are, like I'm here in Phoenix, you're where you are today, and Francis is in Kampala, Uganda, we all are still people, and people is what really connects us. And this idea of how our circumstances really dictate how well and what opportunities we have really stuck with me. And so when I was first starting out in fundraising and development work, I worked on child development projects and helping children like Francis get new opportunities. And we always talked about it as what we were providing was for giving them the opportunity to dream again through education. That's how the program directors talked about it. And this idea of being able to help children be able to create opportunity for children that maybe were born in the circumstances where they had to, fight for just basic necessities was something that was deeply ingrained in me. And I wanted to give back with my time, my resources. So this idea of child development, especially in impoverished communities, is deeply personal for me. Now, I tell you this story not because I want you to be, like celebrating me or my impact in Francis's life, but rather like probe you to think about what is personal to you. Why are you working on the cause that you're working on? Why do you choose to invest your time working for the organization you do? What about the organizations you give to? Why do you give to those organizations? I think what you'll discover, like I did when I did this exercise, is that giving is deeply personal. Like why we give, why we support the causes that we do is deeply personal. And this goes beyond you and I, but I'm sure there are donors that you've worked with or donors that you've heard from that support your organization, and you've heard their story. You've heard why they give to your organization or why they invest in the animal welfare programs that you have, or the human services or the international relief and development, or help, fight against climate change. All of these things are worthwhile causes, and there's supporters that care deeply about these causes. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that we know that giving is deeply personal. However, most nonprofits are actually handcuffed to traditional fundraising systems that are largely impersonal. And this relates to year end because we were talking about how attention is the most valuable currency. How do you earn attention? How do you steward attention? How do you increase your response rates for your year end campaign? And we first have to understand that the reason people do respond is because it's personal. And by understanding that, it's going to help us better understand or better craft how we actually frame our communications to be able to connect with that personally. But we have to acknowledge that the fundraising systems you and I typically use are largely impersonal. And so let me explain this in a different context. So all the donors that support your organization likely gave because there was a personal reason. It could have been because they were referred by a friend. There was a story that resonated with them. They were doing an activity with someone to support a cause, and they were connected to you through social media or through the media. There might be personal friends or connections, but either way, there was some reason as to why someone gave to you. And I don't think we spend enough time actually thinking about that. Like the process for someone to choose to donate to you, like there's a lot of friction involved, but someone pushed through and actually contributed to your organization. And typically it's because of a personal reason. However, then we push them into like our November appeals and our year-end campaigns, and that's largely impersonal. We kind of run them through the sausage grinder, as Gabe Cooper, our CEO, talks about it. And what we see is that people don't give again. And hopefully what you're seeing now is that the reason they don't give again is obvious. Like they came in for a personal reason, and the fundraising or the engagement and cultivation that you and I put out to try to draw them in didn't reflect that. It didn't remind them of that connection. It didn't build confidence with them. And so there's a huge attrition rate. On average, it's 76% of new donors don't ever give again to a nonprofit. And some of that's for outside of your control reasons, but a lot of it's within our own control. And so one thing that we see is that these impersonal tactics like one-to-many, spray and pray emails, direct mail, donors are just numbers. And so it's not surprising that they opt out. The reason they give is personal. The way that we cultivate them is impersonal. And so as we think about our year-end campaigns, like we need to reconcile this, because it's not just a one-way communication. It's not what you and I want to communicate, but it's having a conversation with our supporters during this time. That's what our campaign should really be structured around. And we're going to share how to do that. So stay with me. But at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that we rely too heavily on one-to-many and one-way communications to try to raise response rates. And that neglects the truth and the heart of why people respond in the first place. And the reality of this is that we're seeing like actually a generosity crisis. And this was even before COVID, where the numbers of donors that stop giving to an organization are astronomical. They're unacceptable, in my opinion, that we are that bad at cultivating the generosity of our supporters that we lose half of our donors every year. That shouldn't be the benchmark. Like we should expect better and hope for more, that we would be able to engage supporters in our cause in a more long-lasting way. And in addition to that, we're seeing actually 25% of people in the last decade that used to give to charity have stopped giving to charity. So this isn't just Eric gave to your charity this year and now he's giving to another. People like Eric and I are actually opting out. We're not seeing ourselves in the traditional charitable giving arena, and we're actually choosing to not participate. And when we look into the research of why this happens, it's because of everything we just talked about. There's inappropriate asks, there's impersonal messages, there's lacking acknowledgement and limited transparency, there's poor and unhelpful communication. So donors are telling us that the reason they stop giving to charity is because we as organizations aren't doing the right or aren't cultivating them in a way that keeps that personal connection to the cause. And why they continue to give is almost the exact opposite. Donors continue to give, they say this all the time, when they feel connected to the cause and have confidence in the charity to deliver on the impact or the cause area of their choice. So it's about connection and confidence. And so when we look at our fundraising, we have to understand that the systems are perfectly designed to get the results that we get. And so as we think about year end and raising response rates, we have to start with the fundamentals. Maybe it's our campaign structures. Maybe it's how we go about fundraising. That's actually the challenge. And are there alternative ways? And I think this has become increasingly important of a conversation as the world around us continues to shift and change. It's compounded because we have things like a shift from mass marketing to personal and dynamic experiences. And so we have brands that you and I interact with every single day that are delivering on this desire to stay connected, to keep personalized. And so this is reinforcing and highlighting when experiences are impersonal. And this is forcing a conversation amongst us as fundraising leaders that we have to adjust our strategies, especially during year end when there's increased competition for attention. Even supporters that care about your cause are going to be tougher to reach. And so if we really want to raise retention rates or raise response rates, we have to understand these things because we need to start with the knowledge of the circumstance that we're trying to communicate into so that we can do a better job and drive increased results. And so this personalization everywhere is reinforcing this need and desire to personalize our fundraising and personalize our philanthropy. And so we don't see that reflected. It's not surprising that donors are opting out or donors are moving from your charity to one that is cultivating and stewarding them in that personal way. Because we know that today's donor expects a personal connection to the causes they care about. And that connection is actually what fundraising is all about. As a fundraiser, as someone that's doing donor development or marketing, our goal is to connect our supporters to the story of our mission and to maintain and deepen that connection over time. And we use strategies and systems to be able to do that. And so if we simplify the fundraising definition is, okay, we need to increase response rates. That's a measurement of success, but what are we actually trying to do? What is the approach? What do we need to accomplish? And it's just simply this. We need to deepen the connection between our supporters and our story. And so there's a lot of different ways that have increased the challenge of this because of things like COVID, because of social unrest, because of just 2020. I feel like I should just put a slide that says 2020. That has added complexity to this. Like how you communicate is really difficult. It's really difficult to get people's attention. And I think we talked about that a little bit in the chat earlier. And I say all this not to paint like a grim picture, but it's just to lay the foundation of the reality of the fundraising or the context that you're trying to fundraise in. So if we want to answer the question, how do we raise response rates? We have to understand these principles of what's actually happening. And if you were expecting best practices and like tips and tricks, we'll get to that at the end, but they won't make sense outside of the context that I'm trying to lay right now. So hang in there. If you're more practical, we'll get there. So there's all this chaos. There's all this kind of noise around us. And I know I personally experience it. I'm sure, Eric, you have done as well. And you listening to this call, like you just feel this increased pressure. And we have to realize that some organizations will thrive from the increased chaos. Some will be unprepared and some will merely fight it and lose. The thing is that we can't thrive in an environment we don't understand. And so it's really important that we lay that foundation and say, this is the reality. This is what we're fundraising into. And then we have to begin to ask ourselves some questions. If we know that the fundraising systems that drive most nonprofits were designed for a world that no longer exists, the key questions become is, what do we do? Like, well, how do we actually resolve this? And so we've started by asking these two questions. If our goal is to connect supporters to our story, we want to first understand what can you do to close the gap in this new context? And then ultimately, how do we actually overcome the inertia that will prevent you from being successful at doing that? And so we're going to try to provide some practical insights and tips from our experience, our interviews with nonprofits on how you can go about answering these questions. Because we've worked with a bunch of nonprofits that are trying to navigate these same challenges that you and others on this call are. And the thing that we keep coming back to is this simple explanation. And within all this complexity, it still comes back to this simple explanation. And so let's unpack that a little bit more. So if we know that the first principles of fundraising is to connect your supporters with your story through a series of systems, we have to ask the question of how do we actually design systems that are going to help us effectively increase our funding and the connection of our supporters to that story. And then we talk about how we're going to measure this success. So we have to have a model for measurement, and how we measure that and encourage others to measure that is through these 4 areas. So if you're trying to evaluate whether you're being successful or not at connecting your supporters to your story, you need to know, okay, how are you engaging new donors with your nonprofit's impact? So how are you starting new connections? The second one is retention. How are you building lasting relationships and earning donor loyalty? How are you retaining that connection? So starting the connection, retaining the connection. Cultivation is how are you actually deepening the engagement? How are you moving people closer to the cause, reducing the distance between the donor and the impact? And then ultimately, how many people that are connected to your cause are actually coming back and encouraging others to get connected as well? And so when we look at the basics of this, first principles, connect your supporters to your story, we're going to use these growth metrics to actually measure how successful we are. And so again, if we want to raise response rates, we need to start with the foundations. And so what we found is that to do this well, to connect your supporters to your story and do it effectively in these 4 key areas, we had to ask another question. How are nonprofits accelerating their growth, increasing response rates, and closing the gap with today's donor? And the thing we kept coming back to is this one word that's in relationship science called responsiveness. And so the key to deepen connections isn't just strong relationships. It's actually this ability to be responsive to the other. And responsiveness has this direct impact in how strong a relationship is and how personally it feels connected. And so our team here at Virtuous actually landed on this term as, hey, there's something here. How could we make fundraising responsive? How could we use responsive and the methodologies that are tied into this idea of being responsive as the way that we drive increased results or raise response rates? And so we're going to unpack what responsive is, and then we're going to apply it to year end. And so hopefully this is going to be helpful because it's going to help you kind of see the bigger picture here. So we landed on this idea that if our goal is to connect supporters to our story, and you need to do that through acquisition, retention, cultivation, and advocacy, the key to success there is responsiveness. And so then what we did was we unpacked responsiveness and said, okay, well, what does that actually look like? What is the process at which you could adopt that would reflect a responsive behavior towards your supporters and deepen that connection? And what we landed on was these 4 areas of focus. And so the first is this idea of listening. When we unpacked how do you be how can you be more responsive? It started with listening. And listening isn't just calling your major donors and listening to what they care about. That's important. But listening goes above and beyond that. How are you actually identifying the signals that your donors are providing you? What do they care about? What their intent is, what their interest is? Where are they at on the donor journey? How connected do they feel to your cause? That's what listening well within a responsive framework is all about. How do you make sure that you're listening to your donors and starting there? So when you say, how do we raise response rates at year end? It starts by listening. The second part of this is that you want to actually connect personally with your supporters in as real time as possible. So once we know what we've heard from our donors, how do we connect with them? And so this could be familiar, or others might be familiar with, how do we actually segment our supporters, or how do we make sure that we're communicating through the right channel at the right time to the right people? And so if we know that we're listening and then we're going to connect personally, that's the second step of being responsive. It's not just mass blast, hey, everybody, we're doing a year-end campaign, you should get involved. It's first listening and say, okay, I understand that these segment of donors care about these different things. How do I connect with them now within that context of what I heard? So this is core of segmentation strategy. The next thing is that you want to suggest the right next thing. And so when you think about your year-end campaigns through the responsive lens, you actually want to segment what you're asking people to do at what time. And so by listening well, connecting, and suggesting, you can actually begin to build a model that helps you increase your response rates. And so we're going to kind of unpack what that looks like. So hang tight with me. And then ultimately you're repeating this. And so this isn't just a one-time framework where you say, okay, we're going to listen, we're going to segment, and then we're going to blast. It's much more about how do we listen well and then connect and then suggest the right next step. And then based on what people did, how do we listen again connect, and suggest. And this is something that you repeat over and over and over again to deepen that connection. That's the responsive model. So let's dig a little bit deeper to this and kind of illustrate this. So remember this approach that we shared at the beginning, where we have all these people that gave because of a personal reason, but we push them through the traditional fundraising approach and we see huge attrition numbers. Now, imagine for a moment that instead of looking at it as your whole donor base all coming in personally and treating them through, the sausage grinder approach of traditional fundraising, you actually personally cultivate each individual donor. So we'll use Lisa as an example. So Lisa was invited to an event by a friend. This is obviously a virtual event because we're in 2020. And what we wanted to do is actually send her a thank you email. And so we send with 2-question survey, getting her interests. We actually have the friend give Lisa a call. Then we send a text message from the program team based on her interests. Lisa visits our website. She receives an email with a donation ask based on the page she last visited. And then Lisa gives. And then 15 days later, she receives a postcard showcasing the impact from the product or the programs team, celebrating what she was able to accomplish through the organization. Now, if we look at this, we could say, wow, this is a lot of work. But if we put that aside for a minute and say, would this work? Would we want to cultivate Lisa in this way? I think the answer is yes. And this really reflects the responsive principles because it's based on the donor timing, intent, it's hyper-personalized, and it's multi-channel. And this is kind of the approach that we want to now apply across our entire donor base. So how do we actually do this with Tim and Rhonda and James and Lynn? What does that look like? How could we actually do that? And this all comes back to building a responsive and dynamic campaigns. So how do we actually take each donor and begin to cultivate them personally? What we see is increased retention rates, average gifts, and engagement. All of these are based on the fact that donors are becoming more deeply connected with the cause and building confidence in our charity or our organization to be able to actually deliver on that cause. And so this is a huge difference between the traditional model versus the responsive model. And so what we want to do is actually take this framework and apply it to year end and kind of tease out some best practices. So if you are taking notes, now is going to be a great time to gear up on those notes because we're going to provide 6 best practices on how you can take a responsive lens to your year-end fundraising approach. So let's dive into that. Oops, there we go. So the first responsive strategy for increasing your response rates at year end is actually to start by asking your donors for feedback. And this is something though, even though we're in October and we're getting really close to some of the deadlines of when we need to start our campaigns, how we need to begin to execute creative and deliver ad campaigns leading up to the election and then into December, I still think there's time to begin to ask the right questions to your supporters, because by asking donors for feedback, you're going to get a lot of information that's going to be able to help inform how you run your year-end campaigns. And so a big thing that we recommend is actually doing a survey with your donors. The other thing that we recommend is segmenting your donor base by motivation. So based on the feedback that you got, you actually want to be able to begin to segment. And so you can go beyond the traditional like RFM analysis and giving history and actually seek to understand why a donor cares and then group donors by motivation. Ultimately, what this is going to help you do is hyper-personalize the message to actually mirror the motivation. And so even though you're sending out a year-end campaign, it's a single campaign that you as an organization are putting together, instead of sending out one message to everybody, you can actually begin to fragment the messages so that you can send the right message to the right person. And that's based on their relationship with your organization. You can group by 2 or 4 different motivations. Maybe it's those that benefit versus those that support you. It could be those that gave last year and not this year. They could support this program versus another program. These are all different ways to segment your database in a way that you can begin to be more responsive. So I'll use this chart. I think if you are looking for ways to do segmentation a little bit differently, this is a great chart to keep in mind because it showcases what you're trying to listen for. What is the data that you actually need to be able to begin to personalize your messages? And it's these 3 I's. So there's involvement, which is like, how do donors engage? You could segment on active donors or lifetime giving or volunteer. You could do first-time donors versus long-term donors. You could do people that have attended events, so they have a different context, or they could have given online or offline. That's the base layer of segmentation. The next layer up is on interest. Like, why do they engage? They give monthly to women's support programs, or maybe they give to support, your child advocacy programs. Maybe they volunteered to actually be a mentor for young girls, or they requested more info, or they viewed a child adoption article on your website. All of these signals are going to help you better craft that message, because right now you're probably already imagining like how you would communicate to Emma versus how you would communicate to Luke to draw them into your year-end fundraising appeal and get them to contribute and partner with you at year-end would be completely different. And that's really what this segmentation and listening approach really begins to unleash, really, is like, what is the right message to send to the right people that's going to help drive them to participate and connect with your cause. The last category, which you can only get by doing surveys, and I'll share a story of how this played out when I did this at the nonprofit I was with, is the intent. Like, why do these donors actually engage? From their involvement and their interest, you can get pretty close, but without asking, hey, why do you engage? Why do you care about this cause? You're not going to get the first party data or first party info that you really need to be able to do this well. And so, for example, Emma actually said, she gives because she saw firsthand the value of mentorship. So it's a personal reason. Like, she experienced the impact of the program or service that the organization provides. And so she wants to support and give back in that way. Whereas Luke actually visited the website again after being disengaged. So again, this is him coming back. Like, there was some reason that brought him back, and that could also issue signals for intent. So here's just a quick example of what this could look like and how this really plays out in a practical example. I ran growth at an organization called World Help, and we had the problem where we had a large swath of our donors that all mirrored the same involvement and interest. So they were all involved in the same capacity. They all had the relative same interest, which was our child development programs. And we needed to kind of like unpack this further. We wanted to understand, how do we personalize the message even beyond just knowing what their involvement was and what their interest was. And so we did a survey and asked, why do you give? Why do you support this program? Why would you encourage someone else? And we just asked these open-ended questions. We had over 1,000 people reply. And what we realized is that there was 3 primary groups of motivation and intents that began to surface. The first was that some people support our programs as an extension of the values of their family. So I have 3 young boys, and many of our supporters at that point had young families, and they were giving to child development programs because they were trying to showcase that there's like a personal values of, hey, we care about people outside of our home. There's other children, or there's other people around the world that are disadvantaged compared to what we are. And we're going to support this program as a way to express our family values and what we're trying to teach our children. And that's why we give. Very informative. The second group of people, what we found is that there was an absence of children in their own lives, and that drove them to support child development programs through us. And so this could be that, they didn't have their own children. It could be that they, didn't have a partner, weren't, in a relationship, and still wanted to support children because they, just valued providing children with opportunities. It could be empty nesters. Like, we saw people that had children in their own home that had left the home, and now they continue to support children as an extension of that care for children that they had even when kids were in their own home. And then we had other situations where partners actually couldn't have children. And so they weren't able to actually have their own individual children, or even maybe adoption wasn't an option for them, but they wanted to still invest and give back to children because they knew how important that was, and investing in the next generation. And so they supported our programs. So now we have these 2 distinct things, people that are expressing a family value that equals like today, it's like a family thing. And then we have this other group that's, just believes in the value of children and wants to express that, but they don't have that in their own lives directly. The third group was looking at it much more from like a macroeconomic perspective. So they just believe that the best way to tackle poverty was to invest in the next generation of children. So education, like the classic Nelson Mandela quote, where the way to get out of poverty is to provide an education to children. That was their philosophy. And so we had these 3 distinct groups, and we wanted to begin to express that back to them through our messaging. because how we talk about the value of continuing to invest in children to each of those groups is going to be different. The other thing it provided us was actually 3 new distinct messages to go out into the market with to actually acquire new donors, because now we're reflecting back common reasons as why someone supported our program. But instead of doing that in a single capacity, we're actually doing it, in 3 different ways. And it had nothing to do with our programs. It had nothing to do with how we told the program story. It just had to do with how we expressed why you would want to support these programs, or the types of individuals that support our programs. We turned it into a video campaign, and we saw a huge increase in response. And so I just wanted to tell that full story to show you how listening and doing surveying then kind of reveals all this data through the donor signals, then can actually inform how you do cultivation and retention campaigns, but also can go back out and be fuel for your acquisition efforts as well. So hopefully that illustration is helpful. And I'm sure there's ways that you've already seen this show up at your organization, where you begin to say, okay, we understand that there's different groups of people that support our organization for different reasons. How do we begin to segment and think that way when we run campaigns as well? And this really does work. So there was recent data from 2018, but there's other resources out there as well that said targeting donors on a one-to-one level increases response rates by 50%. So if we're really looking, how do we increase response rates? We have to be willing to do the hard work of listening and segmentation and then customizing those messages, because we know that that's actually the path to increasing response rates. It's not that you just have ultimately, a flashy subject line or a best practice, email template that you're using. That might work in the short run, but what we know works every single time is personalization. It starts by listening and then starts by segmenting and customizing your message. So the third strategy we see responsive nonprofits using in their year-end campaigns is this idea of being human in our messaging. So if we know that our goal is to connect our supporters to our story, it's a very human thing. It's a very personal thing that someone's doing. And sometimes we forget this in how we message. I was a victim to this or not victim, I was a propagator of this, where we would send out these like bold emails that were like from our organization that was like, hey, look at what we're doing. It's really great. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not necessarily going to drive the response rates that you want, because it's coming from a brand, it's coming from an organization. And in our minds, we're able to deprioritize that. And so one thing we see responsive organizations doing is, how do we actually bridge the personal connection with our supporters in how we even communicate? And that starts with your messaging. So things like writing like you talk, communicating from second person, tapping into just plain text emails, handwritten notes, and personal phone calls. Getting others involved, like non-fundraising staff or board members or key donors and partners. All of these ways are tactics on how you can humanize your message. So if you're thinking about year end and you have that perfectly designed email that went through 13 rounds of edits and 4 board approvals, which I've been there, I know how that works. You can strip the humanity out of some of that communication. And so one thing I did, which may or may not be helpful to you, is I would actually just write my first draft of an email, either using voice to text or just only using my cell phone. And what it does is it constrains you enough that you have to write in a personal way. You're stuck in kind of a framework that invites you to be more personal because you're using this. You're not sitting there in a Word doc, like typing out this paper. You're sending a message. And I think being as human as possible in that really works. Next After, an innovation and optimization firm, has tested a lot of this stuff and seen that the more personal you are, even against controls like the space one here or an urgency appeal, if you just send something simple like this, like T2, there was an increased response rate and an increased amount of giving, 75% increase in revenue. So it's not just about getting a response, it's about getting the right response. And what we see over and over again is that the more human and personal you are in your messages, the better they're going to stand out amongst the noise in the environment, and they're harder to ignore. And we see that reflected in the response rates that come out of these campaigns as well. And this isn't just for email. This can be in how you do your direct mail pieces, how you maybe leverage text messages or SMS, maybe even how you use social media. Like, how do you just maintain a human posture in everything you do, and gut check yourself? Am I shouting at a stadium of people, or am I writing a human message? Is it Noah to Eric? Yeah, I might be sending to 1,000 other people that look like Eric, but how do I make sure I'm posturing in my communication and reading it back to make sure, how is this going to be perceived? How is this reinforcing that we're trying to drive a personal connection? People are coming together with other people to make a change in our world. That's what really drives results. And you can do that at scale, but you have to start with that posture of how do we make sure that we maintain a human style in our messaging. Strategy number 4 is actually using dynamic campaigns versus fixed campaigns. So instead of focusing your year-end plan to focus on like drop dates, like we're going to send the mail piece on November 12th. We're going to send the email on November 17th. We're going to, now send another email on December 15th. And then we're going to send 3 emails on the 27th, the 29th, the 30th, and the 31st. That's all great. And there's nothing wrong with that strategy. But what we see is that the more responsive your campaigns can be, the better results you get. And so what we mean by dynamic campaigns is it's less oriented around your schedule and your production calendar and more around the actions and behaviors of the donors. And so instead of pre-planning everything, it's, hey, we're going to send an email that invites people to participate. Now we're going to segment the people that donate. We're going to segment the people that already watched the video we sent them. And we're going to segment out the people that didn't even respond. Now what is going to happen? Okay, well, someone came and visited our website. Now once they visit our website, let's mail them then. And so instead of doing fixed campaigns, you're doing dynamic campaigns. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this well. And we help a lot of our clients do this because at Virtuous, we use multi-channel automation tools to be able to facilitate this. So you can actually trigger these dynamic campaigns and do them at scale. But you can also just do this in a basic way, where instead of pre-planning your communications, you can say, okay, well, what's the likely path here? Then what we should do? What should we do next? If someone gives on November 15th, is that success? Or are there ways to re-engage that individual even beyond that? Like what happens if they do what you ask them to do early? If they give you $5,000 in November, what's the next right suggestion for them? So you're always continuing the momentum, building on the conversation. And that's where dynamic campaigns work differently than fixed campaigns. You're really focused on this idea of the donor journey, not on your campaign timeline. Number 5, I've already referenced a few times, which is just making sure your suggestions are contextual. And so you're asking the right person to do the right thing. So if you have donors that support you every year, you don't need to send them to a video to go watch a video and then make a donation later. You can say, hey, we know that you partner with us every single year and we're grateful for that support. Here's a way that you can get involved early and help us encourage others to take action. Make your donation today. You can have a conversation with them that they're going to give. If they've given to you before, you should start with the posture of like, oh, we know you're going to support us this year. We want to serve you well. We want to partner with you. And you can just ask them directly. Whereas if it's a new donor, you might want to cultivate them differently. Instead of asking them up front, you might want to ask them to watch a video. And then when they watch the video, you might want to ask them to make a donation. It's making sure every suggestion is contextual. It's the right next thing. The other thing here, which is less obvious, is making sure you're asking people for the right amounts. So even when you're asking someone for a financial donation, if you would email Eric and you would email me, the amount that you're asking us to contribute should be dynamic. It should be contextual. If I've never given to your organization before and Eric's given to you, $12,000 over the last 3 years, you should engage us differently. You shouldn't send Eric and I the same email. You shouldn't ask Eric and I for the same amount. And there's a lot of new ways that you can actually design donation pages so that they have diverse gift arrays. So that if Eric's looking at it, he might see one gift array. And if I'm looking at it, I would see a different array. And again, there's some technical aptitude here, but it's just this idea of even creating different donation pages for different people. So if I'm a new donor, you might need to inform me a little bit more about what my donation is going to go to, why I should give a larger amount. Whereas Eric, you might just say, hey, here's a way that you can give. We're so grateful for you. It's an empty box. Hey, we know that you're going to give us your best gift this year. Here's the way to give that. Again, it's about this contextual suggestions of what's the most likely thing you're going to recommend that they do next. And this is kind of accompanies the dynamic campaign strategy. So the last thing here, actually, let me highlight this quick example. It's a great example. It's by an organization called WOTC. They believe universal healthcare should be accessible by all, even the most vulnerable and impoverished communities. And they do this by actually funding hospitals and then retroactively inviting donors to support the care that was provided to those communities. And it's a great model of providing services and then getting donors to crowdfund that services. And it's just a beautiful organization. Highly recommend checking it out, WOTC.org. But what's great here is they actually use contextual suggestions and follow up in a unique way. And I think this is something that you could model at your organization with some creativity, but it's the slight nuances within this one email that is really impactful. So the person receiving this email is named Kyle, and he says, Kyle, meet Peter. He leads the team that cared for Estella, the person that you supported. And he wrote this note to you. Kyle, you and WOTC have done something special, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these notes are personalized to each person, but from an execution standpoint, you have to have the assumption that, Peter is very grateful for the supporters. He didn't write a personal message to Kyle, but it was implied that this message was going out. So use those slight creative liberties to be able to say, hey, Kyle, we're sending you this message directly from the doctor. Now that's impressive already. If I received this email, it's like, wow, like I'm really grateful. Like Peter was expressing thanks. I did support Estella. It's great for the fact that we get to celebrate this. Now, the next thing here is where it gets really interesting, and it's super subtle, but it says this Valentine's Day, but you could say this year end or this holiday season or kind of whatever your framing is for the year end campaign, support one of Peter's patients. So the thing here is that instead of saying, hey, you should just support another patient or you should support another patient from Guatemala, they made it really personal. They said, hey, Peter obviously has other patients. Why don't you support a patient that Peter is helping? You've already helped him once. We've already built that connection. Would you help Peter again? And this slight nuance of personalization is so impactful. Like I read this email all the time and I'm like, I want to support Peter's patients. And I just think there's those subtle ways to personalize the ask, contextualize it in a way that you can really increase the response rates of it because you're making it deeply personal and you're showing up in a responsive way that's going to deepen that connection between your supporter and the story. You are just the conduit to really make that happen. They're not giving to you, they're giving to the impact. And we got to keep that in mind, especially at your end. So the other thing quickly here is that one thing that came out by Accenture, they said poor personalization and lack of trust costs US organizations a lot of money. It doesn't matter. It's $756 billion and causes 41% of consumers to switch. So this is just a reminder that we need to make sure we do personalization well. If we're going to commit to being responsive, we really have to commit to being responsive in its full entirety and really accept the responsibility that as we get in the weeds, we need to be, well done. If WOTC would have sent me that email and said, hey, Kyle, and I'm like, my name's not Kyle, or hey, you supported Estella from Guatemala, and I'm like, I never supported Estella from Guatemala, or why are you emailing? Like, those are the things that like really disrupt. And so it's almost like if you're going to do personalization, you have to be very cautious. It works really well, but you want to make sure that you're doing it in the right context. So you don't unlock the other side of it where they're like, I don't feel like this organization, like that instantly breaks confidence and connection. And so be cautious of that when you use personalization. Last thing here, and I'll end on this note quickly, is just to experiment and test always. Year end is too important to bet the success of your campaigns on your team's wit and clever writing. So if you wrote this brilliant email, again, it's went through all the edits, everyone's really proud of it, and you just send it out to everybody and hope for the best, that's not the best way. Like we can still have creativity, we can still have wit and clever writing, but how do we make sure that we test that in the right way? Send an email to a small batch of people and see how people respond. Get feedback from donors and say, hey, we're going to send out this campaign. We wanted to show it to you early and get your feedback on it. There's a lot of different ways that you can test your assumptions without overcommitting and waiting to January to measure whether you were successful or not. I know Community Boost does this a lot where they test and experiment with different ad copies. Just because you love an ad doesn't mean your donors are going to love an ad or your prospective donors are going to love an ad. You love the cute puppy picture, but maybe the like empty cage is what drives results. Like we don't know. And I think that's why you have to test and experiment. And that's why responsive fundraising is all about listening, connecting, suggesting, and then repeating that process again. And doing that as quickly as possible is going to drive the best results. The last note I'll say before I kick it back to Eric for any Q&A is that at the end of the day, I love this quote by the founder of Save the Children, where she says, you know, our goal as fundraisers, she wasn't talking to fundraisers, this was 1890, but she was saying our goal as people that are trying to drive action or change in our world is to devise a means of making known the facts in such a way as it touches the imagination of the world. The world is not ungenerous, but unimaginative and very busy. And I always end on this note because I think it's a good reminder as fundraisers, we're not trying to convince people. We're not trying to guilt people. Like, we're just trying to make known the facts in such a way as to touch the imagination. It's not about increasing or raising response rates. That's an outcome of us touching the imagination of the world. And again, the world isn't ungenerous. They're just unimaginative and very busy. And it's our job to help translate on some of those things. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll kick it back over to you, Eric. If you want more information on the responsive system and model, virtuous.org, you can find a lot more information on the system. And we ultimately have to make a choice, you know, traditional or we go responsive. And we really need to consider how we can adapt and change. That's it, Eric. I'll kick it back over to you and we can open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. That was just such a good presentation. There's so much that I agree with. In the whole thing, I think we live in a really cool time where we have the tools to do this type of personalization at scale. And even when we're telling stories to new donors, which we didn't have, you know, 10 years ago. So that's something we should definitely take advantage of, whether that's like contextual Google Ads campaigns that brings in people based on different intents and then brings them into completely different flows, or in Facebook ads. And just doing that in a personalized way, I think is a huge competitive advantage for any nonprofit. That I think you definitely showed. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, we would love to put those in the Q&A. I know Noah said he's offering his 50-page responsive fundraising blueprint and playbook. I don't know if you want to touch on this a little bit, but it looks like a pretty cool resource.
Oh yeah, if anyone on the call just shoots us an email, responsive@virtuous.org, subject line boost, we'll kick back you an email with just like a bunch of links. So we'll give you the playbook, 30-minute video showcasing how responsive fundraising works, and a few other links that would be helpful, even an assessment so you can evaluate as you go into year end, but even 2021, how responsive your nonprofit really is and where you have opportunities to improve.
Thank you. And then let's go through some of these questions. Elizabeth Hicks said, excellent presentation. Will the slides be available? They will. I think, yeah, we'll just follow up after the webinar and send you guys the recording and the slides.
Yeah, that'd be great. Happy to answer any questions too, Hillary. If you email here and you have questions, I'm happy to do that.
Cool. We don't have any other questions at the moment. I definitely encourage you guys to ask. We're an open resource. I guess Elizabeth said, how do you know what page they visited? I think that's referring to the page someone lands on at when they first interact with your nonprofit. No, if you want to take that with regards to software specifically, and I can also touch on ways we can do that with ads and UTM tagging.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it from a tracking standpoint. Here at Virtuous, like we actually have a tracking pixel as well. So if someone's a known person and we know who they are, when you click through on an email or you come back to the website, we actually track all of that in your unified profile of the donor. In addition, if you're not a new donor and you're just like a visitor, and then you convert, whether it's like signing up for an email newsletter or downloading a resource or signing up to volunteer or making a donation, we then track back all of your prior engagements with us, and then you put that on your unified profile. So even if you've been engaging for a few days and then you finally make a donation, we now know like what pages you visited and all the activity you've done leading up to that point. And it really just helps you customize, again, personalize different things and understand like what pages people are engaging with, especially donors, like what pages are they visiting prior to donating. You can also do some really interesting stuff in Google Analytics, but that's way above my pay grade. So I'll let Eric talk to that.
Yeah, and like Noah said, there are a bunch of different tools we can use there. I think it depends on what platforms we're using to tell stories as well. So for running Facebook ads, there's different tools Facebook has where you can remarket to people who have visited specific web pages by using like tagging of those web pages. And then with Google Ads, there's stuff we can do there as well. Again, I think a lot of these strategies are a little bit high level, but we're definitely always wanting to hop in on one-on-one conversations to really help you guys, solve the problems that are specific to your organizations. So if you just go to the Community Boost website and fill out a Let's Talk form, we're happy to set up that time. Just because, like Noah said, a lot of this comes down to testing and a lot of this comes down to context as well, organization-specific context. But Craig, let's see how much time we have. All right, we have 3 minutes. Cool. Craig said, do I need to set up a response to every possible persona possible? How many is too many?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's just getting started. So a lot of people don't start because they're like, oh, well, like, do I have to do this one-on-one for everybody? And what I find is that just by starting and saying, okay, well, we're going to just like make some broad assumptions and just have at least 2 people that we're talking to. Then we might segment a little bit further. It's going to help you begin to learn. And so then you can make decisions from there on how you respond personally. I think there's large categories. So even just for year end, if people have already given to you in 2020, you should communicate to those people differently than if they haven't given in 2020, but they gave last year. So there's a lot of even just like simple things. Or if you have 2 separate programs and people have given to one versus another historically, you should communicate to those people differently. So there's even just some like top level things that you can do to begin to experiment with this and express a more responsive posture in your fundraising, and you'll see results.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think some of the organizations that we work with sometimes say they don't have the scale to do segmentation, meaning like if our donor list isn't big enough, it's not large enough of an audience. If we want to segment, 3 different groups, that definitely makes sense. And at smaller scale organizations, it can make sense to start out without segmentation, but also if we lead with those systems in place, then it becomes a lot more possible to grow into them comfortably, as opposed to growing with a massive list that we don't have segmented at all, and then having to backwards segment it, which can work. Like we can do surveys and we can segment people out, but it's a lot easier when we lead with the systems and then grow into them. But yeah, like Noah said, I think just getting started and even starting with 2 or 3 persona groups and then going from there. But the onus is on action at that point. Someone asked, what's the website to get the toolkit?
Yeah, let me go back. Here you go. So you just email me, responsive@virtuous.org, and then we'll send it back to you. You can also go to virtuous.org and you can click on what is responsive fundraising. And that will get you a bunch of more resources as well, if you would prefer that.
Cool. Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to Noah. This is a fantastic presentation. I know I personally learned a lot, and I know this brought a lot of value to the whole audience. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll be sending over the recordings and the slides afterwards.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Eric, and thanks Community Boost team. I appreciate the offer to join. Thanks, everyone.